So yes, my name is Michael Sinclair. I do feel like a bit of an outsider, not because I'm from Scotland, but so I have an interest in health, but I'm a geographer. So I'm very interested in where things happen, working with geospatial data, and that's the sort of background that I'm coming to this from. So I was invited by Will. We met last year, and he's seen some work that I've been doing, and he thought I might have something to share which would be of interest to you. So I'll try to do that in the next 14 minutes. So over the last maybe decade or so, it's not a surprise to you that there's been a large growth in a few different things. So I would say there's three things that have been happening around the same time, which have generated a very interesting set of data, GPS data, other types of spatial data. So one is the growth of smartphones. Two is the GPS technology and the accuracy of this technology and being integrated into smartphones and other types of wearables. And at the same time, the growth of services, apps, which require location. So location-based services within these devices, which we use on a regular basis as we go about our lives. And these three things happening together are generating a lot of passive GPS data, for better or worse, based on our activities, as we live our lives day to day. So throughout the world, the UK and other countries, this data is being collated and collected by a range of companies which are producing geospatial data sets which are de-identified, which they're using for commercial purposes, creating dashboards around like footfall, dwell time, things like this. So I'm going to be talking to you today about this type of data. So the last couple of years, I've had the pleasure to work with some organizations on some projects who are interested in using this type of GPS data to understand the use of natural space, to understand the use of cultural space and sports space. So I don't know if you'll remember the first time you got a smartphone. So I do. It was 2007. I was a graduate, or I was, I think, a third-year university student at the University of Glasgow. I was one of the earlier users of Facebook, one of the earlier users of YouTube, and all of these different, different services which you would use on your phone. And I don't think then, if you asked me, I would have had no idea where this would go, or what sort of power these devices would have, and how they would go on to change society. And we generally think about that in a negative way, and the negative outcomes of use of mobile devices. But there's a lot of possible public social benefit based on the information collected through these devices. And I'm going to be speaking for the next 10 minutes or so about the location GPS data which can be collected from these devices, passively in the background often. So this map, I show this map, I sort of generated this from one of the two data sets that we have for research purposes at the Urban Big Data Centre. So we got licensed for two data sets across the UK for the raw GPS data from companies, you might have heard of a lot of them, Tomoko, Safecraft, Cubic, Geolytics, all of these companies which are producing commercial products, on top of geospatial data which they're collecting from a wide range of different mobile phone applications, which all of us, or most of us, will be part of, whether we know it or not, by consenting to the cookies or any consent that we give through an app. If you actually read well, if nobody actually does read it, but if you did read it, this data is going to companies like this, and they're using this for commercial purposes. And there's a whole host of ethical questions and issues around that. I'm not going to go into too much of that today, although it's something that's really a big part of our research. I'm mostly going to be trying to focus on the positive aspects of what this data might be able to do. So I'm not going to tell you what you can do exactly in terms of public health, because I'm not a public health researcher, but perhaps you can look at this and think, what might we be able to do? And in the Q&A, I can maybe give some of my experience of working with this type of data, which is absolutely huge. So I often ask people what this actually is. What am I showing here? So there's only one thing on this map. It's a gray background. This is mobile phone app GPS data for 1 year in Glasgow for tens of thousands of users, and it's somewhere in the region of 600 or 700 million data points. This is points in space and time with de-identified user ID and almost no more information than that. So we can start to think, well, first off, that might be a bit terrifying to see that this data has been collected and is available, but what might we be able to use this data for? So I produced this visualization. It's jittered, don't worry, so there's no risk to privacy. What this shows is the same data just for a single day in Glasgow during the pandemic. Each one of these dots is a unique mobile device, which is de-identified. We have no information about these users, and it shows their average location within a given hour. As I said, jittered, so it's not the actual location. But what you can see there, it's 11 o'clock in the morning, 12 o'clock. You start to see that the city starts to become alive. So this GPS data with a timestamp represents activity. It represents inactivity. It represents behavior, exposure, all the sorts of things from a health point of view we might be interested in looking at. So like I said, there's been 2 projects which I've been working on with partners from the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, Green Space Scotland, and a range of different stakeholders who are interested in using this type of data to understand how people use cultural space, sports space, or natural space at wide scales. And obviously those sort of spaces have a lot of health benefits, physical, mental health benefits, in terms of access, exposure to nature, which is something that I'm really interested in from a geospatial point of view, and that's where a lot of my work has sort of focused. So quite related to health, but there's a range of different organizations in the UK who are interested in the potential of tapping into this type of data to understand the use of these spaces at scale, trails, national parks, etc., blue spaces, green spaces. So I'll just touch on a few of the outputs, some of the early outputs from this project, from the first one. So trying to explore patterns of park use, using the data from these 2 data sets that we have for across the UK. So the granularity of this data, the spatio-temporal granularity, is something that's very different to other sorts of data, traditional data on how people might use natural space, parks. Normally, we would ask you would state through a survey your activity over the last week or month, or how often you've visited different types of space. But it tells us nothing about specific spaces. It tells us nothing about the time that you were there, or where you were specifically in terms of those spaces. And we tried to answer a lot of different questions in these 2 projects, but I'm just going to show you a few sort of visual results to give you an idea of what this data sort of looks like through these 3 guiding questions. So firstly, this data is completely de-identified. Can we, in an ethical way, identify at a geographic level where people come from and assign secondary data to that to have an understanding of reach, catchment, how far people travel, etc. Can we look at where people go in parks and what they're exposed to when they're there in terms of the facilities, the site and context-specific information in parks? And also, can we look at temporal spatial patterns of use based on different types of users, different groups in the population, which in the case of this data is at a geographic level, but for other types of GPS data, this could be potentially at the individual level if you had the consent and you had users involved in the study. And I'm talking from the point of view of parks, but actually this could be any type of space. It could be blue space. You could be thinking about, supermarkets, fast food restaurants, all sorts of other questions. So the study area for this one particular project was Glasgow City region. So there's almost 400 parks that we were looking at, but we did scale it to the UK level afterwards. And we've done a lot of different things, but I'm just going to show you how this data looks to give you an idea, and then you might think yourself how this might be used for sort of population health research. So the first thing is, where do people go? So where do people go in terms of public space, in this case, green space? So what this shows is public spaces in Glasgow, and we've obviously masked this data to a level so it's not the individual point data. What you can see here is this is data mapped for a given month, and these are parks in Glasgow this is all the users that are in the data set. But you start to see the granularity of this data, and obviously that, the potential of this is huge. Also ethically challenging this sort of data is being collected at scale and being used for commercial purposes. But so far in terms of research, it's not really been It's not really been tapped into as much as it could have been, and there's a range of challenges and reasons for that. We can also look to understand where people come from. So based on, is it going to play? Well, I'll just explain to you. At a geographic level, you can actually look at the reach of parks and where people come from, at a level which gives us information about how far people travel, repeat visits, things like this. And then we can break that down in a range of different ways. So we have the information on that because we can re-identify at a geographic level in a way that doesn't risk privacy, but that makes the data much more useful and usable. So I'll highlight one specific park just to show you what you might be able to do, or just to zoom in a little bit. This is a large park outside of Glasgow, has a lot of different facilities and quite a wide reach. So the first thing, this again is data just mapped for a single month, and it's both data sets collated together. So because we've re-identified the geographic level, we can sort of assign some socio-demographic information, and we can start to understand where it is that people, or what they're exposed to, what sort of behavior people, or the spatial patterns of behavior for different socio-demographic groups within a study area, in terms of parks, but this could be in terms of a lot of different species. And then further than that, we can break this down by using secondary data from the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, or you could use a census. You can start to break down spatial patterns, temporal patterns at different days of the week, hours of the day, and where people are located in terms of different facilities or characteristics of species at the individual park level. So this sort of thing just would be very challenging with other types of methodologies, other types of traditional data. When we rely on people telling us what they've done, this data represents a form of revealed preferences data. And what's very interesting about this is it allows us to look back in the past and look at interventions possibly. So if something's changed, we have this data over a long time window, you could go back and look to see how did behavior potentially change based on those interventions. So I'll finish with some challenges with this data, and there are many challenges. And then the potential that I see. So the first one is technical challenges and access barriers. I mean, we're the home of this sort of data here at Google, but this data is very large. It's difficult to work with, and keeping that safe and being able to use it in a way which is useful to public research is a major challenge. Secondly is data quality. So this data is messy, it's structured, but the underlying mechanisms through which this data is generated are messy. They're often unknown to researchers, and the companies who have the consent to collect this data, even they often there's underlying processes through which this data is collected in terms of different consent. Consent can change over time. Different types of apps might represent different types of behavior. So then you capture different things in the same data set. And that leads to this measurement bias issue. So we've done a lot around the sampling bias and trying to wait for this, but trying to actually measure, how do you know you're measuring what you're trying to measure when some of these underlying mechanisms are unknown, so therefore difficult to correct for. And the most important one is around ethics and trust. So this is around keeping the data safe through safe infrastructure, trusted research environments, using protocols like the 5 safes, researcher training, output checking, ethics applications, data management, like strong data management practices. All of those sort of things are important to make sure that this data can be used towards the public good, and we need to make sure that the public are on side with this type of research. Otherwise, there's a major risk, and I would understand why they might not be, and the fact that this is in the hands of a lot of sort of commercial companies. So I think that there's, despite all of those challenges and sort of ethical risks to this data, there's a range of areas which I think that are really interesting to explore in the future. I've showed some of those already, but the spatial and the granularity of the data in terms of what you can do spatially is one of the most important. Second, this is a form of sort of activity data, inactivity data, exposure. So we can see how far people travel, we can see how long they spend in a certain space. And then also accessibility. So in combination with what is actually available in space, in terms of the allocation of services, we can actually see how people use space in a way which other types of data would not allow us to do. And then linkage, so linkage to other types of data, because we can do this at a geographic level, and a lot of health data, you know, it would be at that level you would have to be linking this type of data together. So I think that in terms of, if we think about other fields, I sort of compare this in some way to the earth sciences and what remote sensing done for the earth sciences and how that revolutionized that entire field. And I think that this type of data really possibly represents like a paradigm shift, a paradigm changing moment in terms of how we might sense, you know, society in terms of social science, health science, and other types of disciplines. But there's a lot of ethical risks and other things that we need to be careful of in doing that. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. So thank you very much. And it's now my pleasure to announce Nick Taptiklis. He's head of R&D, please come, at Cambridge Cognition, where he leads technological and scientific innovation in digital assessment of cognition. He has led and leads very large international studies where cognition is assessed in the community. And we are very looking forward to hear your talk.
Thank you very much. I should say, I've led Cambridge Cognition as part of large studies. I have not led those studies myself. It's important to point that out. So, right, so you already know my name. I'm going to be focusing on the use of the touch screen to assess cognition and the opportunities that this afford. So Cambridge Cognition, we mainly develop touchscreen digital cognitive assessments to be used in academic and pharmaceutical research as well as in healthcare. So brief agenda for the next 15 minutes. I'm going to give a brief primer about how cognition is assessed before touchscreens, in fact, and today many times. And then I'm going to talk about 3 case studies illustrating the potential for touchscreen digital cognitive assessments, both the ability for us to uncover richer behavioral data because of the way that we can actually see in detail how people are interacting with the touchscreen itself, but then also, and I think this is relevant to this meeting, talking about what we can do with the touch screens which are on everybody's phones and how we can assess behavior out in the real world and at home. And I'm going to touch upon, I think, an important topic when we're discussing research at home, which is how do we know that people are going to adhere to a protocol when they're not being supervised, and show some data showing maybe pushing back against assumptions that many people have that active cognitive assessments are going to have less adherence and more sort of data gaps than passive data. So now, apologies for, I know there are people in the room who know all of this already, but I think just a brief primer on how neuropsychological assessments are conducted, or how, well, they're still mainly, to our frustration, conducted today this way, with a trained clinician or a researcher using pencil and paper assessments face-to-face in a room with the research participant. And in fact, the recent drug approval for Alzheimer's treatments that have been in the news, those approvals were given on the basis of these kind of assessments with highly trained clinicians with the patient, more than an hour of face-to-face testing. And this is a very expensive way of conducting research. It doesn't scale. And it also introduces a kind of a measurement bias because patients are recruited partly on their ability to reach a clinical research site. So that's not a truly representative sample of the population who are being tested. standard cognitive assessment batteries, they're often 1 to 2 hours long. They'll use multiple different individual cognitive assessments, and these individual assessments are generally designed to tap into specific aspects of brain health. So maybe probing different aspects of memory, working memory, episodic memory, or attention processing, speed, and executive function. So in aggregate, they then allow the researcher to build a really detailed profile of the participants' cognitive health in a multi-domain way. But now I'm going to talk about the digit symbol substitution task. And this is not really one of those assessments. It's not, from a scientific point of view, it's actually very messy, because to do this task, participants need to draw upon a wide range of cognitive skills. So it doesn't give you a particularly clean aspect of, for example, some part of their neuroanatomy or any particular neural circuitry. But it is actually useful because of its messiness and because it's drawing upon multiple brain skills. It's kind of a bit of a canary in the mine, as it were, because it's sensitive to cognitive change, drawing upon those wide aspects of cognition. So to do this task, the participants are given this piece of paper, and at the top of the piece of paper, sorry, up here, you'll see there's a key. And so we've got a list of numbers, and below them there are abstract symbols. And then it's a very simple task. The participants then, with the pencil, they then go through this kind of decoding list, and underneath each number, they write down the symbol. And the outcome measure of this, it's very simply the number of symbols that they get correct in 90 seconds. So this means that it's a very useful, brief, low-burden cognitive assessment with broad applicability. And for this reason, we decided to build a digital touchscreen version. And when we set about doing this, we really wanted to keep the applicability of the data that we gather on our version with respect to all of the kind of the in-depth literature that exists, and so that our patients assessed using our task can be compared to other data sets. And so this was so for this reason we set about building this so that patients would actually need to draw the symbol just as they do in the pencil and paper version, rather than, for example, just tapping a button. So this is capturing more behavior. It means it's closer to the original, and we have done validation studies where patients have done both the pencil and paper, the digital variant, and they very closely align, so that's nice. But also, by doing it this way, this enables us to capture a whole lot of more information that you don't traditionally get, because we're capturing the time stamping every part of that motion. So we're able to capture far richer, fine-grained behavioral information that you get from the pencil and paper version. And we hypothesized that there would be sort of clinically relevant information here. And in fact, in a study, we found this was the case. So here we have in the plot below, we've got patients with Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease, and healthy controls, and also immune patients. But there are many Huntington's disease patients and Parkinson's disease patients whose total score, the number they get correct in 90 seconds, looks pretty similar. And so, they appear to have very similar kind of cognitive things happening just at the surface. But if we look beneath the hood of the data and we start to look at the timing information that we've done here, we can see that the Huntington's disease patients, many of them are actually, there's quite a delay before they start drawing. And this is why they're kind of doing the more high-level cognitive processing. Whereas the Parkinson's patients, they're starting the drawing at a similar time to healthy controls. But because it's a movement disorder, their drawing time is slower. So these two patient groups, they end up with having very similar overall scores, but that's misleading. And below the hood, we can see these differences. So the next case study I'm going to talk about is Project Intuition, which was a study led by Apple and Biogen. And I think from a health research at home point of view, this is interesting because from the outset, these researchers were really keen to try and get a truly representative sample of the US population. So trying to match the cohort for socioeconomic factors, as well as gender, age, levels of education. The participants did need to have an Apple phone to join the study. But they were provided an Apple Watch. So in terms of thinking about previous conversation about percentages of the US population that have a wearable, they were trying to avoid those kind of biases here. And initially it was meant to be a 24-month study. It got cut short for commercial reasons, but by that stage, 23,000 people had already completed 12 months of assessment. So, and I was very excited to just find out before that Daniel Rogan, named on this Nature Medicine paper, is in the room here today. So that's very, very nice. So during this study, patients once a month, they performed an extensive battery of our CANTAB assessments. So these are these touchscreen assessments were developed by Trevor Robinson's lab at Cambridge University in the 1980s. So touchscreens were a big deal back then. And so these are very much assessments targeting specific aspects of cognition. This is a very memory-heavy battery, and as Daniel and I were just discussing, nobody really knows what Apple were kind of trying to get out of the study, but we can see that they're really leaning towards memory. So, and the participants also performed high-frequency burst assessments of our Cognition Kit smartphone touchscreen assessments. So the NBAC working memory assessment and our friend, the digit simple substitution task. And they did these assessments multiple times a day in bursts of 10 days, 4 times over the year. So once a quarter. So quite an interesting data set there. Now, coming back to the issue of adherence, active assessments versus passive assessments. The Apple team published this in that Nature article I showed previously. So here we see adherence to the cognitive assessments. We've got the healthy controls and the kind of self-reported mild cognitive impairment cohort in the orange color there. We can see that the healthy controls have got pretty good adherence to both the high frequency and the monthly cognitive batteries. Less so for the mild cognitive impairment cohort, but still respectable. But how does this compare to the wearable data? The passive wearable data. Well, so here's the Apple Watch data. And I think, this is the interesting thing to see, is actually there is really not much difference between adherence to just wearing an Apple Watch versus actually having to stop what you're doing, pick up your phone and actually perform a cognitive assessment. So this is my last case study. I think one of the things that I know already today, speaking to other people in the room, I know that we're excited about the possibility of bringing together large data sets, making up composed of wearable data of different kinds, along with touchscreen data, to start to build digital biomarkers, perhaps, and be able to measure things that have not really been able to measure before. And a great example of this is fatigue. So there are no objective measures of fatigue. There are validated clinical scales where people answer basically how fatigued they are. And so the idea behind the HRfH project is to try and develop a digital biomarker of fatigue that could be potentially used as an endpoint in clinical trials for treatments of fatigue. Fatigue is a symptom that really matters to many patients. It really impacts neurology and immunology patients. And many times patients that report fatigue as being the symptom which impacts their lives the most. And an important part of this kind of research is involvement of these patients, you know, to steer the research. And this is, and IdeaFast has had, you know, really extensive patient involvement. So this is a photo from the last year's General Assembly with some of the patients talking about their experience of their fatigue and how they were able to sort of get on in the study. And importantly, with this 6-year project, for the first year involved a feasibility study which recruited more than 150 patients, and to try out many different modalities to explore with patients themselves what was an acceptable and feasible way of measuring their fatigue. And that helped inform the design with those patients of the centerpiece of the study, which is this large clinical observational study. I've suddenly noticed I've got 45 seconds and I need to speak fast. So we've recruited almost 2,000 patients now. The study will be finishing in August this year. We've got patients with Parkinson's and Huntington's. Actually, you can read those. I'm running out of time. So 4 bursts over 24 weeks. Our psychomotor vigilance task, our friend again, the digital substitution task, VAS scales presented on the smartphone, and once again, a burst study design to minimize patient burden and also get a good signal. So the study's not finished yet, but we've been having a quick look at the data. And here we're looking to see whether there are interactions between the disease group and adherence to the study. And what we're finding is that these patient groups that we know who have fatigue, there's no significant sort of impact on their ability to follow the study. Last cheeky slide, because I'm over time. And here we see in this study that we can measure with our friend the digit symbol substitution task, only 90 seconds once a day. And we've got here we have in blue, we have got neurology patients. We expect them to have cognitive impairments. We've got healthy controls in green, and we've got immunology patients with a very interesting amount of cognitive impairment in orange in the center. We'll be publishing this data soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you. We'll do some questions at the end. We'll bring on our third speaker. There he is, Matthew Thompson. With Google for the last 3 years, I thought it was a home game for you, but you came all the way from Seattle to present here today, and you'll share some of your insights into how we can use data from mobile phones, cameras, microphones, and some of the challenges of doing that.
Thank you. Thank you. And first, a big warm welcome from the Google Health team. It's great to have everybody here, and I appreciate Will inviting me. Google, we've got about 120 doctors, nurses, psychologists spread across the world, across many parts of Google. So it's a real privilege to be here. So I think I'm here for 3 reasons. One is I've been a GP for about 30 years, both in Oxford and the US. I've been a GP academic researcher. Much of my research has been about how to use vital signs, physiologic signals to detect bad things. Children with meningitis, adults with cancer, that type of thing. And then this last phase of my career, this last 3.5, 4 years, I've been at Google, where we do research across many different types of wearables, earbuds, smartphones, trying to commercialize these and put them on our Pixel phones and smartwatch Fitbit devices. So I'm really pleased to be here. And I'm going to talk about 3 sensors that we all have on our phones. And I think at least one of those you don't know about, which is radar. And I'm going to focus on some of the challenges and some of the opportunities that these commonly held smartphone sensors could give us. And then lastly, end with maybe a challenge for the group to see if we can work on something together and solve a big problem. Obviously, I work at Google and have Alphabet stock, just my conflict of interest. But I'd say most of this talk is based on my personal academic thinking and feeling. And you'll see I present lots of data, most of which is not from Google or Google research. First, smartphone cameras. The camera is probably one of the things that people decide on when they're buying a phone. The pixels, how good the photograph is and what it does, all the magic. And I'm not going to talk about dermatology. There's been loads of research on dermatology, teledermatology, detecting skin cancers and many of the challenges. And right now you can use your Pixel phone and something called Google Lens to take a picture of your rash, and it can match with other rashes. So these kind of technologies are out there. They're also out for retinopathy screening using smartphones. I'm not going to talk about those. So we had this question, what would it take to detect anemia using a smartphone? So anemia or low hemoglobin is globally a massive problem for women and young children, causes considerable morbidity and mortality. Fortunately, it's usually quite easily treatable with worm treatments, iron supplements, etc. But here in the West, as a GP, probably a blood count is one of the most common tests I order in my practice, usually for people who are tired or women who are having a lot of menopause, menstrual bleeding, pregnancy, and sometimes for cancer screening or cancer detection. So it's a really common test. Here we use blood tests, venous blood tests. Other countries, they use finger stick pointer blood tests or cruder methods. And as doctors and nurses, we're trained to look for anemia with the tongue or paleness on the fingers or paleness on the conjunctiva. So the question is, could we use a smartphone to detect anemia? And there's two things from a smartphone you could probably use. One is taking a picture of bits of the body, like the nails or the eye or the tongue, which we'd expect to be pale. And the second is this thing called PPG signals. So photoplethysmogram, bit of a mouthful, is the kind of red light. If you ever put your finger in a pulse oximeter at the doctor's office and you get that red kind of pulsing light, you can get exactly the same thing when you put your finger over the camera of a smartphone, PPG signal. And it's becoming extremely useful to detect many things. So we set about a study. This is largely funded by the Gates Foundation for data collection, but also Google contributing a lot of engineering manpower and person power to this. So this is a study happening in India. It's recruiting a tribal population, so a poorer community within India. Adults and children coming in to the doctor who are getting a blood test anyway, we'd recruit them for this study. Take pictures of their eyes, their nails, their tongue, collect a PPG signal from their finger, and deliberately use 3 different phones, like a cheap one, a cheaper one, and a very cheap one. So we don't get into the mistake of only using super expensive $900 phones on everybody, because that wouldn't apply in the real world. And this is just some images of the data collection tool, which is a nice little app that was developed that would help the researchers take pictures appropriately of the fingers, the nails, the tongue, and also this PPG signal. So what did we find? You can see here on the horizontal axis, hemoglobin going from extremely low, hemoglobin of 4 in this kind of red zone, to normal, 14, 15, 16. And I think there's a couple of other GPs here. It's very, very rare for me to see people with a hemoglobin less than 7 or 8. These are extremely sick people. But what's I think is impressive with this, we've got probably hundreds of people with moderate or severe anemia. So this is now one of the biggest data sets ever collected. And this data will be made freely available for the world. This is not a Google commercial product. This is a Gates Foundation piece of work. So what did we find? Using the best analysis, and this is kind of hot off the press this last couple of weeks, to distinguish anemia from no anemia, sensitivity, specificity in the 70s, okay, they're kind of moderate. I mean, they're not wonderful, but maybe the bottom row is the most important for a particular country like India, differentiating severe anemia, which is the condition with the highest morbidity and mortality, versus mild, moderate, or normal. Sensitivity of 96%, and a false positive rate about 30%. So potentially useful. But drilling down a little bit more, what if we wanted to not just do accuracy, sensitivity, specificity? What if we could try and get towards called blood level accuracy, which is kind of mean absolute error. And you can see here with the latest data where we've got about 2,500, we've got down to a mean error of 1.3 grams per deciliter. Now, that's not very good. In a blood test in a commercial lab in the world, the accuracy from that would be tenfold better than that. So this is nowhere near the accuracy of a blood test. What's also interesting is we've predicted here how many more adults and kids you'd need to recruit to get even better. And if you look at the horizontal axis, we're at about 2,000 people. And we can predict to get from a mean error of 1.5 down to 1.3, 1.1, we'd need 10,000 people. So this is a good example of the massive scale of data collection to start remotely getting, but not even close to kind of blood level accuracy. So it's a big challenge here. So for me, this conclusion here, massive data sets needed to develop this kind of technology, and perhaps diminishing returns in terms of thousands of people's data to try and get acceptable accuracy. And the question is, what accurate for who and for what use? This may well be accurate enough to use in rural India for house-to-house screening by maternal health care workers. Not accurate enough to use in the NHS for screening or for, let's say, monitoring someone with cancer or hemoglobin checking. And you can see for a company like Google, would there be a particular incentive to develop a technology like this, which is not quite going to be as accurate as a blood test? So question. Second one is radar. So I didn't realize that most of our phones have got radar emitters and receivers in them. Many phones have this. And radar, or UWB radar, is used in many devices around your house. So I was just lapsing into my Scottish there. Smart speakers, televisions, phones, they all use radar, usually for things like unlocking your car or AirTag, smart tag kind of contacting. But we had this, does anybody have some water I could borrow? That would be great, sorry. We had this idea about, could UWB radar measure heart rate or breathing rate? Now, as a GP, I'd find it really helpful if I could have something to measure adults and particularly kids' heart rate and breathing rate without me having to touch them or put my hand on them, because anybody's got kids, they start screaming and get unhappy. Personally, I think this would be a huge value for me as a GP or triage nurse, but what if you're a parent? Could be valuable for you as well. The advantage of radar is it goes through clothing. It doesn't matter if your skin tone is darker, where some of these other technologies are limited, and you wouldn't need to touch someone. We all see our chest walls moving all the time as you breathe in and out. And yes, doctors are trained to look for little pulsations in parts of your chest to see if your heart is moving. But we wondered whether radar could measure these micro little movements as your heart and your big vessels, thank you, pulsate 70, 80 times a minute. So this was a study done in collaboration with people in Sheffield, Savannah, and Mobile. We used, and this is published now, we didn't have a smartphone itself. We had the kind of inner workings of the smartphone as a research tool. And we put this both on the table facing someone, as you might do if you were sitting at your desk. We put it kind of next to their arm, because you'd expect this big artery that pulsates away that you can probably see. You'd think it would be able to pick that up, and some other directions. And you can see here, the accuracy of this is actually pretty good. Look at this mean error of 4 beats per minute. So for anybody that does clinical care, 4 beats per minute, that's pretty darn accurate. I suspect that's more accurate than me guesstimating an adult or kid's heart rate when they come into my surgery. But what to do from this? Potentially adequate accuracy. This is in adults at rest, not with fast heart rates, not with irregular heartbeats. And for a company, is there enough priority for this particular technology? Radar is never going to be developed solely for human heart rate, breathing rate detection. And as a company, you could think, well, we can measure heart rate from your smartwatch, from your Oura Ring, from your earbuds, from your phone, from other places. Is it worth moving ahead with this technology? And I think I use this as a typical example of academic research that we do, where we have one great publication and it just doesn't, even though the results are good, it just doesn't move on because there's just not enough incentive for all these players to get together. But it's out there if people want to take this further. And thirdly, microphone. And this is, again, what do people buy smartphones for? Being able to take pictures and talk to their people, talk to your friends. So microphone is a hugely important part of a smartphone. And us and many of others have looked at cough detection. Cough is really common, acute cough, COPD, lung cancer, cough is super common. Not only that, there's many, many, many drug trials, particularly for lung cancer with these new lung cancer drugs, where cough is one of the symptoms when people start relapsing. Smartphone cough detection is tricky. You need to differentiate cough from some other noise. You need to differentiate your cough or your husband, your wife, your friend's cough. There's all sorts of privacy issues of this thing recording sound 24/7, and if you're on the bus or at home and other conversations. And I just leave this here with, this is a really good example where, in this case, a company called HRfH has developed and marketed and uses this cough detection technology, which is actually pretty accurate. So this is nothing to do with Google. This is another company. And just picking one study at random from PubMed. This was a study in Australia where they used cough sensing as well as symptoms to help GPs detect pneumonia in adults and kids coming into their surgery. So you can imagine this, look at the area under curve of 0.95, pretty darn good, pretty darn good. So this is an example of a technology that is already in prime time use in many places and drug trials. So that's a really good example. So let me finish with this, just thinking about this conference. So how close are we from using these smartphone wearable tools to actually making a difference of big problems in the UK or the US? And I'm going to pick cancer or cancer detection as one example. So 1 in 2 of us develop cancer. 8 out of 10 people who develop cancer are diagnosed after they go to their GP with symptoms. That's how cancer presents. So we published this article as a bit of a thought-provoking piece. Could your smartphone tell you if you've got cancer? And yes, there's many signals on a smartphone or wearable that could indicate cancer. Hoarseness of the voice, anemia, change in activity. We looked at geolocation earlier, body composition, temperature changes with pancreatic cancer. But I think there's a whole bunch of challenges to try and take this theory into a trial that we could do in the NHS. All sorts of issues from selecting the signals, getting people to wear these things long enough for enough months and years to detect the cancer. Some equity issues, different skin tones. We heard earlier about inequity in terms of who can afford these more expensive wearables. Then unintended consequences. A cancer detecting smartphone thing is never going to be specific for cancer. It could detect depression or social isolation or many other potential confoundings. So let me leave you with this. I've heard this as a theme for so many talks, this need for collaboration between industry, where I sit now, communities, whether it's patients, caregivers, GPs, hospital doctors, and the academic research community. And I really think the sweet spot is where this conference is excelling and finding ways that we can work together. So thank you.